Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series on intro syntax. Today, we are going to talk about ditransitives and how to analyze those in our approach to syntax. That's going to lead us into a couple of interesting topics. So we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about sort of the nature of selection and the relationship between verbs and their arguments. We'll also talk a little bit about uh, a construction that's not talked about in the Carney textbook, known as the ECM construction for exceptional case marking. I'll talk a little bit about why that's not a very good name for it. And we'll see some other another analysis for it. As a note, the Carney text uses a lot of a functional category called agar, agar O, agar S. I am going to not use that very much. Probably, I may talk about it in one video, but I'm not typically going to talk about that node. That's a functional category that which separates case assignments from other functional categories. Do read about it in the Carney text, but just for our purposes, I'm gonna try to avoid it. I also got a few requests about the article I posted. To mention or questions about that. It's not really appropriate in this video series. There is a TED Talk, TEDx Talks, I should say, on that article. And I will try to post a link to that. I think I can actually do that if I'm sophisticated enough in this YouTube. So I'll try to do that. So, yeah. Other than that, let's go ahead and get started. So today I want us to think about this problem of ditransitives. So the basic problem of ditransitives is if we think about the structure of a ditransitive. So if we take something like Selicum gave Hadass a book. And we try to tree this in our using our X-bar schema as it is right now. We're going to have some problems building this structure. The basic problems are we don't really have enough sort of syntactic positions to fill all of these things, particularly to give the sort of nature of, to sort of account for the fact that we want Selicum. Selicum needs a theta role, needs to be associated with, in some way with something like give, and so forth. So that's one of the challenges we're going to try to deal with today is how can we account for all of these? And obviously, when we look at something like English, English has a property of many of these ditransitives that it is associated with something called dative shift. So Selicum gave a book to Hadass. So, we could, argue that, well, this lower tree seems to fit more neatly with our structure, but we'll see that even this seems to not work when we sort of explore the binding principles and the binding properties. And that's actually where we'll start. So I'm going to modify this sentence a little bit. I'm going to use the verb show. But the ditransitive properties are going to remain. So our sentence is going to be, Selicum showed Hadass to herself. And we're just going to initially try to write this sentence using our X-bar schema, which will put that prepositional phrase as an adjunct. Now, we have good reason to suspect that this is not correct, and indeed it is not. So we will build this structure up. So remember, as we are doing this, this is ultimately going to be a hypothesis that we need to reject. So we're doing this as an exercise, but do not take too much from this, because we are ultimately going to reject this. We're going to need to modify this structure. T should be here. VP. So a lot of the work is going to be done down here. So to get this structure to work, we're going to have V-bar, positional phrase. Looks like the mail just came, so sorry, the dog is going to go crazy for a little bit. Oscar, stop! Oscar, enough! Buddy, come here. So really, we can do all the head movement, all of that, or all of the, not head movement, A movement, and all of that. But the real critical work, and we should do at least some of it, but the real critical work is this relation right here that we need to show. So let's get to our S structure so we can show that this relation is going to remain. So we're going to need to move Selicum up into the spec of TP. Oscar, please stop. And that will get nominative case and check the EPP feature there. And then there's some sort of relationship here between T and showed. But really the critical relationship is down low, and given our current assumptions, showed is assigning a theta role and is assigning case to Hadass, and is assigning a theta role to Selicum. This should be to herself. So really, the critical question here deals with, so we know the sentence is grammatical, so now the question is, how can we explain its grammaticality? Well, we have a anaphor down here, herself. And if we recall principle A, anaphors must be bound within their domain. So we would need a little co-indexation here. So these are co-indexed, but then the next principle is that they must be C-commanded. And this is not C-commanded in this structure. So this DP Hadass only C-commands showed in this structure. And so herself is not C-commanded within this domain. Therefore, we would predict that this sentence is ungrammatical, but it's perfectly grammatical. So this is at least one problem that we have with these types of structures, which is that they incorrectly predict the binding relations that we find in these sort of mandatory ditransitive structures. Now we could, kind of play around with the sort of, there's ways around this explanation. We could say that, C command works differently in sort of adjunction structures and things like that. So this isn't like necessarily a like something that sort of casts us dead in the water. So let's move on to our other structure, and this is initially a problem that was discussed in a really famous squib by Bars and Lasnik. And again, we're gonna use a very similar example, except we're not going to look at the one with the preposition. We're going to look at the one with the double object. And so one of our questions is, how do we get these arguments in where they belong? So following our sort of phrase structure rules, our X bar schemas, we don't really have a position to put these arguments in, and it's sort of a problem. So one solution is just to say, well, when we're dealing with these structures, these ditransitives, maybe we have a flat structure. So that we can explore as a hypothesis. Again, this is a hypothesis we are ultimately going to reject. So here we would put our the verb showed, and then it would just take a double complement. And we're kind of, playing fast and loose with some of our assumptions here, but that's okay. And I'm actually just going to, we're not going to worry so much about building up the rest of the structure. We know that Seligman is going to raise out of here. But this is the D structure of this verb phrase here. And we know that ultimately these two things are going to end up kind of remaining down low. Somehow the verb is going to doubly assign case to both Hadass and herself in this structure, which is also a little unusual. But then again, we've never seen something take a double complement before, so perhaps this can we can doubly assign a theta role and doubly assign a complement, maybe, So, and this more or less works. There's some problems with this. This does seem to be a principle C violation with Hadass, but we've talked before that principle C seems to be the most violable in some ways, or at least the one that is, I haven't talked in this video series, but I certainly talked to my class about this, that principle C is maybe the least grammatical of our principles. It's the principle that seems to be most pragmatically driven. So we could certainly say that principle C is maybe not a grammatical principle, but a pragmatic principle, and again get around this, and it does rescue our principle A. But it does again run into problems with our other types of first, it's just a flat structure. You know, and it, you know, these sorts of exceptional stories need to, you know, probably need exceptional data to try to explain them. Beyond that, this structure makes another prediction that does not seem to hold, which is that we should be able to reverse these. So we should be able to say Seleucum showed herself Hadass and get the same grammatical result. But that one doesn't seem to work as well. And that is not predicted by this structure. So here is where we really need to do some work. And this is where a number of scholars have come along and said, well, there's a number of things we can start to notice about the verb phrase. And, you know, over the last several videos, I've said that the verb seems to assign an agent theta role to its subject. But there really does seem to be something sort of majorly different about the relationship that a verb has to its agent than the verb has to its other arguments. And the most critical ways we can look at this are we can look at the forms of idioms that we see, and we can look at the types of relationships that we see, which are more in this sort of domain of idiomness or just sort of the way in which verbs are interpreted. But one of the things we can look at, and we could take, this is data that was originally, I think it was originally discussed in Morantz. It may have originated earlier than him as well. But you can take a verb like kill. And kill has some interesting properties. So kill, it can vary tremendously based on its theme, based on the object it takes, but not based on the subject it takes, its agent. So you can get things like kill the bug, which means to end the life. And you can get some ambiguities with all of these as well. So, and we can talk a little bit about these. You can kill the bottle, which means to drink the bottle to completion. Kill the conversation. You can kill the audience. And obviously, you could be a horrific mass murderer and kill the entirety of the audience. Or in the more sort of natural reading of this, you make the audience laugh a lot. So there's an ambiguity there. It has sort of this null, or we'll talk about the null reading as well. But this art, you know, so you can get both of these. You can get this reading where you make the audience laugh a lot. That's a sort of comedian reading. But notice that's associated with the object, not with the subject. And there's a bunch more of these. So what's interesting about this is that all of this is associated with the object. So it doesn't matter if I say the comedian killed the audience, killed the conversation, killed the bottle, killed the bug. The comedian, even if I say, when I say the comedian killed, you might say, well, that's clearly showing the comedian is influencing the interpretation of the verb kill. And to an extent, you might be right, but that's only because the verb kill, when it doesn't have a overt thematic subject, seems to take audience as its in its general often seems to take audience as sort of its understood subject. Many Many verbs, many obligatorily transitive verbs in English have these sort of understood objects when they don't have an overt pronounced object. So if you say, you can say, I ate a potato chip, for instance, but you can't, and you can also just say, I ate, but you can't utter I ate in the instance where you only ate a single potato chip. You have to say I ate to mean that I ate something equivalent to a full meal. Similarly, with like drinking, you can drink water, you can drink tea, you can drink coffee, but if you say I drink, it must mean that you drink alcoholic beverages. So we see these types of null interpretations existing all the time. We see these with objects. We don't see these with subjects. So there's a really critical difference between the interpretation of objects and the interpretation of subjects, and the relationship that a verb has with its objects than it does with its subject. And so it's this insight that led us to say, maybe there's something more to this. Maybe there really is sort of a breakdown between the subject and the object in a sort of fundamental way in the syntax. And we can use that to explain the difference between, we can use that to explain how we can derive these ditransitives. So we're going to introduce a new sort of piece of structure into our syntactic structure. This is what is known as voice. You'll often hear it pronounced as, described as little v. That can also be a little tricky because there are other uses of little v that are not associated with voice. Again, we are, as linguists, we are terrible with our terminology. You would think that linguists who use language as our object of study all the time would be better at using language to come up with ways of describing language. But we're not. We're so bad at it. So bad at it. I had another student asking, based on our raising and control video, about little pro. So that's the difference between pro and pro. Yeah, we're bad. I'm sorry. Anyway. So voice, that's what we're going to talk about. And voice is basically this idea that we are introducing, that the verb kind of has this, it is encoding the sort of core lexical predicative part of the sentence. But then the voice is there to contribute things like causation, perhaps passive, things like that. And that it's the agent, when there, is there as a cause, can be there as a cause, for instance. So we can think about something like Seligman gave Hadass the book as Seligman caused Hadass to have the book. Now I'm really letting my distributive morphology sort of roots seep through there. That is not necessarily how many syntacticians view that structure. It's how I view that structure. But that's sort of the core idea, is that the voice is really contributing this, the main is introducing our agents in a way that is separate from the core sort of lexical predicative property of the verb itself. So let's see this at work. So we'll again go back to show. So we're going to have our verb phrase down low. And rather now than having the verb introduce the external argument, the agent. We are going to have it introduce our it's going to be a position for both of our objects. So we're going to have herself. We'll have us. And then what we're going to introduce above this is this new position, this voice. And voice is a can come in different flavors. You'll hear this term flavors, flavors of V, flavors of voice. And this voice here is an active voice. It's a causative voice. We'll just stick with active. But this voice here is ultimately what can assign case down to this DP. And the verb will raise into voice. So we're going to get head movement of the verb into voice. And many languages, and we can explore this in future, many languages have overt morphology here between these two. And there are even languages that really distinguish between having overt voice and having overt lexical verbs. We see this in languages like Persian. And again, we'll see this in future videos. And then we get Selicum, rather than emerging as the specifier of our of the verb itself, it's the specifier of voice, which can assign a theta role. And that's when voice is active. And so voice can also be passive. So now we have a new explanation for our passives, and in which case it has no theta role to assign. Perhaps has overt morphology and so forth. So that's basically our the explanation that we have here. But the rest of the tree structure is going to be the same as we've done before. But we now have a new position, a new available position structurally to put arguments in, which allows us to explain our ditransitives. As I said before, I wanted to talk about another construction that is not really mentioned in the Carney book. And I'm going to do this very briefly. It relates somewhat to these types of structures and some of the things that we've been talking about before. But I think it's a really critical in a couple different ways. It is critical in that it is it's a place where we see the terminology of linguistics really not matching with the actual facts that are happening. And there's some reasons behind this. It has to do with sort of some entrenched ideas about how language should work, not really mapping up with how the theory should work, not really mapping up with the facts that were actually being presented. And then also it ties into our notions of, I saw this comment in a discussion with Dr. Carney about, as he's working on some revisions for the 4th edition, Omer Preminger from the University of Maryland made a really, really important point, which is that there is a double disassociation between case and theta roles. And this is a point that I think is frequently lost, which is that, so nominative case and accusative case, so nominative case is frequently associated in English-like languages with subject position. Accusative case is frequently associated with object position. And things like theme theta roles are frequently associated with object position, and things like agent theta roles are frequently associated with subject position. But this association is not always there. So just because you are an agent does not mean you will have nominative case, and just because you have nominative case does not mean you are an agent. Just because you have accusative case does not mean you are a theme or any other sort of typical typical sort of object. And just because you have accusative case does not mean that you are one of those typical object theta roles. And we're going to see that in this. So this is a phenomenon known as exceptional case marking, also known as subject-to-object raising. And really, subject-to-object raising is the better name, but exceptional case marking is sort of the name that is stuck around a little bit more, because that's how the phenomenon was analyzed for so long. So the basic sentence we're going to go with is Hadass believed him to be truthful. That's sure. So this is our sentence. Now, we can do a couple different things with this. We can analyze the fact that if we have a overt, if we tense this and we can add in, we can see that in fact this subject here will be a nominative case. So Hadass believed he is truthful. Or he was truthful, you know, it doesn't matter. But it is clearly the case that there's not something like, and the reason I'm showing that is it's clearly not the case that this him is somehow starting high and then having some sort of pro-relation with something down low. This is clearly a raising construction. So, and fortunately, the analysis that we just gave of with the structures we had before allow us to analyze our the structure, this type of structure. So I'm gonna just quickly run through this tree. I mostly just want to do this as a point of sort of analysis. Again, I'm going to start with a TP up top. Recall that there is a CP, but I'm doing this mostly for space reasons. And I'm going to make a few critical points as we walk through this. Okay. Okay. I still have a few things to fill in here. I'm gonna start our verb. I'm gonna actually put B in our voice position. 2, remember, is minus finite, but plus EPP. I have he beginning in as the specifier of truthful. And again, this is for theta position, for theta roles. And Oscar, please stop. Sorry, now the mail has actually come. All right, sorry about that. Not only was the dog barking, but then I had a couple quick technical issues. Trying to pick back up where we were. He down here, which obviously is going to end up becoming him, is again, as I've been saying before, is omnivorous for case, and that goes back to that point that I was making based on Omer's point about the sort of double disassociation between theta roles and case. So it really, again, we can see that in these types of raising constructions that these subject to object raising constructions, that these subjects of these lower clauses are going to end up in accusative cases, with accusative case. So in this sentence, and I also left off Hadas up here, and we have I think this was plus past, but the important thing is EPP and nom. And Hadas is just going to move up. We can just do that now. And it's really the journey of this here that we care about, this he. So following, again, our minimal link condition, it's going to go into voice, up into T. It will check the EPP feature here. But this ultimately is not a good enough position for it because this is a minus finite position. And it still has that omnivorous case feature that it needs to satisfy. So it's going to raise again to try to satisfy this case feature, which it does satisfy on the basis of voice. Voice has that accusative case that it can assign. And so he becomes him by the nature of this sort of relation that it has, this local relation that it has with voice. But it moves out of the embedded clause and up into the matrix clause, into the matrix object position. And that's subject to object raising, also known as exceptional case marking. But here again, we see this, and it's the availability of this extra object position that allows this to happen. It's the same basic structure of a ditransitive. And it's actually the principles that we've seen all at work throughout throughout syntax that allow this to happen. And so I'm going to go ahead and close the video there. As always, I want to stop with a quote. I'm going to go with Rilke again. So this is let everything happen to you, beauty and terror, just keep going. No feeling is final. And again, I just know that where we are right now, there's just a lot of uncertainty, a lot of worry, and I just hope that, you know, as we all kind of work our way through this, that we can remember that we're all struggling, but we're all also you know, moving through a place where this isn't the final step on our journeys, and we're in this together. And I hope everyone is safe and well, and I will see you next time. Thank you very much.